There is no doubt that Star Citizen has one of, if not the best looking trailers and media of any game-like project. Very well shot, rendered and presented. They're so good that many of them could make you think that, well, Star Citizen is fully playable and enjoyable game at a, typical 60 frames a second fashion. I mean, just look at this stuff. It's pretty cool. Well, as it happens, I recently picked up myself the best gaming PC on the market right now, and I was itching to test it. And so, after booting up the latest Star Citizen version, honestly, I was surprised how smooth everything was. I thought that maybe this time, Star Citizen was not just playing it up for cheap clicks, but actually playable. But of course, after a little bit more testing, things were looking downright horrific. So what is going on? Was my first impression just a fluke, or is Star Citizen marketing misleading people? Again. Or maybe Star Citizen actually is finally playable, and there might be something going on. See, for years now, wherever you go and see a cool gameplay trailer or a technical feat, be they game forums, Reddit, or your own friendly horse-beating Discord server, usually you can hedge a bet that that video is from Star Citizen. And hey, I agree, if there is one thing Star Citizen does extremely well, it's convincing naive space dads with low standards on how cool this second life in space actually is. But seriously, putting my extremely mean comments aside, if you listen to my creator peers who covered the project or ask a casual fan or see any official media, you could be easily convinced that, at the very least, Star Citizen is a playable game. But is it? And of course the usual suspects like cockroaches come out of the woodwork to claim, but it's Star Citizen, it's an alpha, don't judge it. So yeah, you do know that very sentiment I made into a meme for a reason. So move on, middle-aged children, no one cares anymore after the 10 years. So anyways, since I got new toys, I wanted to see what is doable in 4.1 update, and so I got to work. Now almost immediately I noticed something weird. Star Citizen was running smooth. Now I thought to myself, no, can't be, this is the same Star Citizen after all, but it runs downright acceptably, in 4K no less. So I genuinely thought that, well, color me impressed. This could be the moment where I could start having fun with this playable sort of a frame rate, even if most other things are broken or finished. Then I had a thought. Hold on, TheYamiks, you better check yourself before you wreck yourself. I booted up my VR PC that got my hand-me-down upgrade from the old horse ripper build, and yep, there it is. Star Citizen still runs like complete ass, even in 1080p. But why? Is Star Citizen only playable if you spend your whole life savings on one single GPU that costs more than 2 mid-range PCs or one high top-end? Well, that is kind of what I wanted to find out. As a matter of fact, can you really call your game playable if you can only run it smoothly on the top 1% of the gaming PCs in the market currently? Alright then, so important notes before we go on. Today I'll only focus on the performance aspect of Star Citizen, not the finished state or quality of its features. Also, outside of this intro segment, I'll refrain from including my opinion, so you can draw your own conclusion. And hopefully at the end of the day, you can learn something interesting. Now, we begin with the hardware. Earlier this year I picked up the most spec'd out gaming PC possible. Since it's an all AMD build, I decided to call it Red Commie. Now note, yes, I didn't pick up the Nvidia 4090 or 5090 GPUs, because they're really stupid, and no, this is not an opinion. Even right now, the XTX from Radeon is an extremely good price to performance for the top end, without, again, not being stupid. However, there is one stupid thing that TheYamiks might have done. Used 4 sticks of DDR5. Well, it's not impossible. DDR5 systems struggle to utilize more than 2 sticks of RAM if you want anything above 4800 MHz frequency. This is a memory controller limitation. However, in my testing and tuning a little bit of timings, it has not yielded noticeable performance drops beyond a few percent. Still, if you're in the market for DDR5 system, save yourself some headache. Outside of video editing, TheYamiks does not recommend using 4 sticks of DDR5. But anyways, either case, this machine will represent the top 1%, which it easily is. Now as for my VR PC, now according to Steam survey, at the time of making, the most popular GPU is the RTX 3060. Now what I got is a hand-me-down 2080 Ti, that was the top line GPU about 7 years ago. Now today, my humble VR PC with this graphics card still manages to be above average, and a good touching grass example. As for the software, CapFrameX is a fantastic tool that under the hood uses PresentMon and Rivia Tuner to log the data and display it in a digestible fashion, while Hardware Info 64 is a good general hardware sensor reading and logging tool. Now onto Star Citizen itself. Since it doesn't have even a handful of settings to change, there's not much variance. Still, either everything will be set to lowest or the absolute highest. Of course, the lame crotch FSRs or any other upscalers are disabled, and CIG's TSR for anti-aliasing is used. As for resolutions, either the 4K or 1080p will be examined. And so let's proceed to logging the data. Now, since it is impossible to really do repeatable runs in Star Citizen, I simply opted to do some 890 jump or a holding mission, mostly because I enjoy them. But regardless, they would feature a little bit of planetside walking up to the ship, then traversing with the ship up to the space, a little bit of combat there if it's possible, and then some FPS at the end. Now that would be wonderful. However, remember, these are not definitive or amazing examinations of the data, but rather just a simple showcase of what a normal customer would encounter. So, without a further ado, let's see the results. Now, like I mentioned before, my red commie, that thing down below, is a fantastic machine with the smallest amounts of bottlenecks possible. Now, when I tried to test the performance, honestly it took me by surprise how smooth overall performance was, especially compared to my past experiences with Star Citizen, which, frankly speaking, hasn't been the most stellar one. In fact, I got used to the lack of stuttering and smooth frame pacing, like a real game, that I was starting to actually have fun while testing. It really was remarkable how interesting Star Citizen could get if the performance was sorted out, but I digress. I immediately noticed something odd about Star Citizen while testing in 4K. After you log in and get spawned into your bed, let loose to do whatever you want, Star Citizen keeps on loading something into the RAM. In this log data, you can notice this very same thing happening. This is in big part the reason why many inconsistent stutters and freezes happen to everyone. And it really didn't matter if it was 4K or 1080p, even on an NVMe SSD. This constant loading continues to happen for about 20 to 30 minutes. It's bizarre. What's even more bizarre was that this process kept on repeating every time your character died as well, as you can see in this picture. And we'll return to this. However, first, let's go into the results. Now for 4K maximum details on this ultimate gaming PC, I got 56 FPS on average, with 5% low at 41 FPS and 1% lows at 17 FPS. But hold on, why use these 3 different frame rates? Isn't average just good enough? Well, remember, average frame rate can be very misleading. It is important to see the 5% low, which represents most stressful game moments, while 1% lows indicate how bad the momentary stutters can get. So the higher both these numbers, the smoother the experience overall feels. Still, the maximum settings are a luxury rather than the norm, and the real sauce, if you will, comes from the lowest settings, and this is the mode I tested the most, even segmenting it in multiple parts. Starting with a simple stroll around Microtech up to the hangars, average frame rate of 53, while planetside rising up to 97 average while doing dogfights in middle of nowhere. And then going down once more to average of 70 FPS while doing the 890 jump mission inside the ship. Now, you notice the average frame rates as well as the subsequent percentiles almost double when going into the space, and it kind of makes sense since there's little to handle and render. In fact, I did, for the sanity check, test Elite Dangerous and No Man's Sky, which presented about a similar behavior, some more, some less. But back to Star Citizen, what about 1080p? Still, the most common resolution in Steam hardware survey. Well, there are improvements. 104 average frame rate. Even though this sounds like a small improvement, remember this was capturing both the planet side and the space stuff together. However, the biggest spike is by far in the more important 5% and 1% numbers. 5% jumping to 73 and 1% jumping from 20 to 31. Both of which indicate a very playable performance. This was the point where I started to think that, oh, hold on, is it really the time to start taking Star Citizen, like, seriously? However, let this be a lesson to especially all the tech illiterate space dads. Saying that, well, hey, it runs fine on my PC, or, oh, but I'm not seeing anything bad, is a really shit argument. Even I, well, granted only for a second there, still forgot that I was using this overbuilt PC that cost a pretty penny just to get barely 60 FPS. Something that in PC gaming has been basically a starting line for performance since late 90s. And for console peasantry, early 2010s. So every time you hear fans, creators or streamers talk about and praising Star Citizen, especially for performance, try asking them, what kind of PC are they running and how much did they pay for it? Because you see, it's extremely easy to get out of touch as soon as the performance is not insulting you, if you will, that bare minimum 60 FPS. And the gamer's favorite excuse of, fuck you, got mine, starts to set in. So I get 60 or whatever performance that feels fine to me, so everything's fine, you know, by probably spending way too much money, but regardless, fuck you and your data and critiques and complaints. Seriously, do look out for that sort of behavior, because it's a very easy trap to fall into. And what luck it is that we have just a grass to touch, as Star Citizen is offering public telemetry data on what performance and frame rate averages are the people getting with some basic performance specs. Oh, well, look at that! For the recommended spec, people with RTX 3060s are reaching about 38 average frame rate. Well, that kinda sounds low, but for the humble 3060 and an average CPU, it is to be expected. Now, we'll return to this chart, but first let's take a look at what my VR PC can do, shall we? The shock, the horror, the stutter, and the slow-ding. This, no lie, is the performance I got on my RTX 2080 Ti and the rest of the stuff. Okay, I think you could tell that something's off, or at least you should if you were paying attention. Now, this horrendous performance is really no lie. Well, except for the fact that it runs on 4K max settings and on the hard drive. Yeah, well, okay, I was having a little bit of a laugh. Now, in fact, a while back I did a whole video on running Star Citizen on a hard drive versus a RAM disk, and the results were, well, to say the least, they were weird. Still, the main takeaway was essentially that Star Citizen was loading still something, even after giving you the reins, or after the loading screen, which is a bit weird, but regardless, if you allowed Star Citizen to load everything in after about minimum 20 minutes, which, yeah, that's how long it takes, you could see about the same performance on an SSD as on hard drive. Well, as long as you stayed in the same place, in which case, if you start moving around, well, yeah, hard drive's gonna suffer regardless, as data needs to be pulled in and out. Now, to demonstrate what happens if your storage is too slow, here's another extremely detailed and unoptimized to this day, but finished game. Cyberpunk. As you can see, the poor hard drive is struggling super hard, but if you were to let it load, it would work normally. And this is exactly what happened in the joke 4K test for Star Citizen. The program, or a game, will run, sure, however it will either produce extreme glitches, which will cause inconsistent or highly disruptive hitching and stuttering, or it will crash. So to give my VR PC and this test the best chance, 1080p, all low settings will do the trick. With average frame rate of 53 while on planet side, while jumping up to 60 FPS, average during the 890 jump mission in mid-space, sounds like an actually could be a playable experience for even the average Joe and his mid-range PC. Still, there is an elephant in the room, and if you look at the footage right now versus the trailer footage like this one, I don't think I need to point out the obvious here about Star Citizen's marketing. Still, what's more important than misleading and downright lying marketing is actual stats here. So, notice the red commies 4K data is rather similar to average FPS of the 1080p on the VR PC. However, the 5% and 1% differ in a very noticeable margin. And this is where the key to proper frame rates lies. Now first off, this is 60 FPS average in a scene with only one spaceship and couple of NPCs for your above average PC to struggle with. While in say something like, I don't know, Cyberpunk, you can muster a far more detailed environment with far more complexity. But yeah, of course it is comparison between single player and multiplayer, whereas networking usually does have a little bit of performance impact, up to maybe even 15%. But what's even more important for Star Citizen's footage is the stuttering and freezing frames, or rather the inconsistent frame delivery times. Even though the number says 60 FPS average, it didn't feel like an actual true 60 FPS. But hold on, Yamiks, how could this be? If the data says 60 frames a second, how could it feel different? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, it felt more like 30 to 40 frames a second. And if you ever dealt with multi-GPU setups or simply run an actual mid-range PC, or a low-end especially, you might know exactly what is going on. But before we move on to the whole educational segment of this thing, really can you call this playable? And more importantly, are the trailers like these really representative of how Star Citizen is actually being played? Okay, so we got the whole stats, but more curiously, the average Joe setup, even though reaching barely 60 FPS, didn't feel like it? Well, how could this be? Well, as a matter of fact, if you watch that RAM disk video, it hinted already at what is going on. So why don't we take a look at the RAM usage? Now, like I mentioned before, Star Citizen, even after loading screen, keeps on loading something into the memory for the next 20 or so minutes. And to demonstrate it, I even captured this very same thing happening, the stutters in the progress as I left my character simply lying in the bed, not moving at all. Do you notice these spikes? Yep, these spikes, especially when you're running around, you will notice. But listen up, this is very important. While examining the full RAM data, due to having over 100 gigs of the stuff, I was able to take anything that Star Citizen threw at me. And at the end, it didn't really matter whether I ran low or high settings, 1080p or 4K. Star Citizen demands around 35 gigabytes of RAM alone. Now that is insane, and not in a good way. Just to put it in perspective, if you're running a DDR5 system with just 2 sticks of memory, maximum of 64 gigs of RAM, you might be hitting the limit and need to offload the stuff to page file with just a few too many browser tabs open at the same time, let alone running any other third-party tool, for example, in the background. As for systems with 32 gigs, well, you're gonna be constantly hitting that page file. So, what happens when you run out of RAM? Well, oddly, not that much. Sure, there will be some hitches, there will be some stutters, but essentially both Linux and Windows uses something called a page file. A file on a hard drive that is essentially used in place of extra RAM or overflow. And it constantly swaps out memory from there. Obviously, because NVMe storage at best at times is still quite a bit slower than actual RAM, well, that's where the whole hitching comes in, but it's not a big hit. Though it really does depend on how much memory needs to be swapped out. The more it is, well, the bigger hitches there are. Now, there is another thing I noticed, and a lot of people already know about Star Citizen, and that it's just simply unoptimized, and more so, it's CPU bottlenecked more than GPU. Now, even in my own testing, you can see this phenomenon in here. So what, just basically get a better CPU and you get more consistent frame rate? Well, yeah, sure, that is basically how it would happen. However, this is still inexcusable. See, CPU bottlenecks happen mainly in games with heavy simulation aspects. Think of RTS, builder games and the like. In fact, X4 in a late game struggles because of sort of this simulation aspect of it. However, Star Citizen simulation happens mostly on their servers. So this is either simply the failure to offload more work to the GPU to calculate if necessary, or, and this is just a rumor, Star Citizen is so incompetently coded that their netcode is trying to handle and update positions and information about far too many unimportant objects. In fact, you could say that this rumor is substantiated by the simply shitty performance in Arena Commander minigames, where you literally have nothing but a dogfighting or FPS scenes in static environments. However, this still does not explain why that 60 FPS average on my VR PC didn't feel like a true 60. Well, for that we need to take a look at the GPU, or more specifically, the GPU's VRAM. Here I gotta say big thanks to Radeon for simply offering more VRAM to their graphics cards, allowing them to stretch their legs more often than not. And for my XTX variant I got up to 24 gigs, which provides leg space to stretch them properly. So as I started logging the data for 4K maximum details, Star Citizen demanded 16.5 GB of video memory. In the low settings for 4K, 15.5 gigs of video memory. However, more importantly for 1080p, Star Citizen still required 13 GB of video memory. This means that any GPU, like for example the RTX 3060, the most popular one right now, hell, even the recent 5070 with its 12 gigs of video memory, will suffer. Okay, but clearly according to the telemetry in Star Citizen's own data, well, there are people playing with 30 to 40 frames a second average on a GPU that has 8 GB of video memory. Sure, these graphics cards are not exactly the best performance, but they are budget kings. So 40 frames a second is still playable. Yeah, you remember that even in my own testing, the 60 FPS that I got with my RTX 2080 Ti with 11 GB of video memory was still missing about 2 gigs according to my testing with a bigger rig. Yeah, it kinda shows already that even if you're missing those 2 gigs, you start to notice those stutters, hitches, or inconsistent frame times as system is trying to load something in and out. So what do you think is gonna happen when you're missing not just 2 gigs but 5? See, when your PC runs out of video memory on the GPU keeps on loading in and out data from SSD and hard drive. However, unlike system memory, or RAM, the penalty for this constant memory swapping is inconsistent frame rates, or worse, tremendous stuttering. Sure, because of this, the average frame rate might drop a little bit, but the actual experience and frame timing will be so severely inconsistent, it won't feel like the actual frame rate that you're seeing. And this starts to happen even if a little bit of memory is out of place, unlike with RAM. And so those poor souls trying to run Star Citizen on the 8 GB 3060 will run it, sure, but that 40 FPS average is gonna be looking closer to 20 or less. And this becomes almost ironically funny as you look up Star Citizen's own recommended spec page, where they recommend 8 gigs of video memory for a GPU. I do wonder what kind of recommended experience can you have with that. And so this is where the telemetry page can be misleading at best. Now sure, it shows the 40 FPS averages, but in reality, without knowing those 5% and 1% lows that I mentioned before, well, the experience I start to suspect is gonna be closer to 30, maybe 20 frames a second. And to put it in perspective how common this stuttering will be is just to look at what Nvidia is offering in the last 7 years. Only 5 graphics cards from their offering, the 5090, 5080, 4090, 4080, 3090, and that's it, would be running Star Citizen without VRAM issues. Now, of course, Intel Arc and Radeon would have a bit better experience, on a cheaper as well, but generally speaking, the sheer memory alone will cause massive grief, let alone the lack of RAM or simply having an average CPU. If even one of these things are out of place, you will start to notice something wrong. And I really have to put a point on this. Star Citizen is not some special ultra mega super game that requires a monster of a PC like Crysis did back in the day. It's not that at all. Sure, it does host a lot of impressive models and textures, but it also is extremely unoptimized and, honestly speaking, somewhat incompetently made. So, is Star Citizen really playable if you don't have the top 1% of the gaming PCs in the world in the current moment? Well, you tell me. Or are you gonna tell me that, well, it's running good for me, so I don't know what you're complaining about?